Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Welcome, Jonathan Williams, who is the CEO and Chief Economist at American Legislative Exchange Council. You've been hanging out with the bigs this week, John, sitting down with Howard Lutnick and talking about American energy. I am glad to read that Ohio is the future of energy. Isn't that the conclusion you reached?
Hey, Ohio's doing some big things on energy. There's no doubt about that. We had Vivek Ramaswamy at our ALEC meeting last week, as you know, had a big Ohio delegation. They've been passing some great things. And one of the great new ALEC model policies is actually having a rational definition of what green and clean energy should look like. As we've talked about, Hugh, we had Louisiana pass it and Tennessee pass it. It all started in Ohio saying, let's actually talk about this in a rational way. And things like nuclear and things like hydro and things like clean natural gas should all count towards clean and green energy. It started in Ohio. So, yeah, you're right. As a Michigander with my good mitten behind me, I'm not afraid to admit occasionally when Ohio gets it right.
Well, what I like about it is I was talking late into the night last night about AI. AI sucks up a lot of energy. It's going to be in North Dakota. It's going to be in Ohio. It's going to be in Pennsylvania, places that are cold a lot of the year and have a lot of natural gas, either stranded as it is in North Dakota or abundant as it is in Ohio and Pennsylvania, even a little West Virginia. And I think, what's the REINS Act have to do with this? That part I don't understand.
Well, any of the deregulatory measures, right? Some of the ways that the unelected bureaucrats in the administrative state have tried to stymie energy development and affordable, reliable energy across the board, right? That happens a lot of times with no accountability since those folks don't put their names on the ballot. The great thing about the REINS Act, even though our good friend Mike Lee came just short in having it included in the federal legislation with the BBB, we've had now over 20 states pass our ALEC model REINS Act to say the major questions ought to be determined by the legislature or reviewed at least if the cost of the regulation is more than, let's say, $1 million to you. And so taking it out of the hands of unelected bureaucrats and putting it back into the legislative branch for review of these costly regulations, many of those regulations that have targeted energy and oil and gas across the board. So I think that's the optimistic point about the REINS Act.
Jonathan, I had breakfast this week with a fellow named Jonathan Bush, who's going to be running for governor in Maine. And I'm in Maine for a couple of weeks. And I'm going to interview everyone who's running. But I said to him, have you heard of richstatespoorstates.com? And he said, no. I said, go get that because you got to find out where Maine is ranked. And you're going to find out that with an 8% income tax and an estate tax, it's not going to be ranked. It's a poor state. It's an old state. It doesn't have to be that way. If they would adopt some of the ALEC policies, like Indiana has. I hate to give credit to Indiana after the Pacers threw the Cavaliers out, but you were in Indiana as well for the big get together. It's number 3 in economic number 3.
It is, and it's a state that not very many years ago, Hugh, Indiana was middle of the pack in rich states, poor states. And so you can pull up your phone, pick up richstatespoorstates.org and see how your state ranks. Indiana has moved up from middle of the 20s to number 3, starting with Mitch Daniels and one of the best governors in America, in my view. And I think you agree with that assessment. They became a right to work state. They become a tax cutting state year after year. And it just goes to show that not all of the important big policy changes need to be flashy. Indiana's been very slow and methodical, but they've moved dramatically in the right direction. And they've begun to buck the trend in many of the other states in the Midwest that have been population out-migration states. Ohio's just turned it around to become an in-migration state, and Indiana's been a state that's held their own, not just in population, but in GDP growth and manufacturing jobs as well.
What I told Mr. Bush was, get this book. And I told him richstatespoorstates.com. Is it just .org or is it both domains?
Either one of them work.
Okay. I said, get the book, study it, and find out what ALEC does, because Maine can become a mecca, but people aren't going to come here with that tax structure. Finally, you were on a DOGE panel discussion last week. Does DOGE work at the state level, Jonathan?
Sure does. And I think our ALEC members are leading the way at taking the concepts that ALEC has been talking about for decades that then were popularized by President Trump and Elon Musk and Vivek with the federal DOGE effort, and taking many of those same principles to the state level, because the dollars and the waste might be smaller dollar amounts at the state and local level, but they still exist, and the government still need to be reviewed periodically for ways to find government efficiency. Every single state, even the best run states like Utah, number 1 in rich states, poor states, are looking at things like this to continue to find that waste and inefficiency in government that's just inherent to government, right, Hugh? And so that's a great process. Our ALEC Government Efficiency Coalition continues to meet on a monthly basis. But I'll tell you what, Hugh, at our ALEC annual meeting last week, I was sitting there presenting on that panel. It was a standing room only crowd of more than 200 legislators and others just dedicated to this idea of how do we take this DOGE idea and make it happen at the state level going forward. And not just a one-time and done approach. We're talking long-term commitment to spending relief. And I think that's exactly what Americans want right now.
Now, ALEC is a sponsor of this show, and I love that because I think you are making a difference every day. I want to know, though, do you feel momentum at the American Legislative Exchange Council? Are more states serious about the quality of their legislation? Because that's what it comes down to.
Well, there's no doubt about that. The excitement, the enthusiasm was palatable last week in Indianapolis. I know it came live from the exhibit hall there last week on the show, Hugh. But I mean, we had a record amount of state legislators, nearly 500 state legislators from across the country, nearly every state represented, coming to learn about the best practices of free market policy. And we had about 60 pieces of new model legislation that were endorsed by our legislators at this meeting that are going to be going out and considered for the next legislative session. And between that and just the amazing amount of requests that our team gets on a daily basis to come and provide that trusted policy solution type of advice to state legislators across the country. Hugh, I mean, we're winning in DC, but we're winning even more at the state level. And that's really exciting to be a part of.
What I really want people to hear is if you're a state legislator or a staffer, join ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. I've never asked you, Jonathan, can staff members of state legislators join ALEC?
We love to have them involved. In fact, we had an entire staff training track in Indianapolis last week to talk about some of these very key policy issues. In some of these states where in Texas, a state senator represents 1 million constituents, they rely heavily on those key staffers to be able to get these policy ideas and help formulate them for the legislators going into the session.